Alec and Joe retired from the dredges. About that time, their brother John had a client down in Waikaka who had built a dredge but had run into financial troubles. And so the McGeorge brothers were able to acquire the dredge and the associated claims for a piece of land of 200 acres in the Waikaka Valley. Before purchasing it, they were sensible. They got out their drilling machines and they went and they drilled and they worked out how much gold was in this flat piece of land. And of course that was the big difference. They could then start to know what their future returns were likely to be. They'd got sick of having shareholders at that stage, and so the three brothers and their wives formed a family. No outside shareholders, they just got on with it. They purchased a dredge from Bannockburn and carted it down to Waikaka and reassembled it, and the McGeorge No. 1 got started at Waikaka. There's a picture of them drilling. They've got a traction engine there, and they're banging the pipes down into the ground, and from that they could get the samples and they could then assay that to see how much gold was likely to be there. Whoops. The McGeorge No. 1, and it worked from 1902 to 1916. This is a very different situation to dredging on the Kawara River, isn't it? See, they're actually on flat land. The dredge is just sitting in a little pond. They had to dig the pond before they built the dredge, and then floated the dredge in the pond, and then the pond just moved with them. As they moved the dredge forward into the land, the pond just kept moving. So there's no issues of the access problems, etc., that there were on the Kawara. The coal could be brought up to the side of the dredge quite easily, and so just a totally different situation. And I think it's interesting that this dredge worked for so long, where the Kawara dredges were at quite short time frames, and this just quietly went away. It was getting close to being a gold factory, that it was just extracting the gold and just working along. It wasn't had the dramas of dredging on a river.
Did you have the water for that part, or was it the water tank?
The land at Waikaka apparently at that stage had a very impervious layer, and so it was actually quite boggy, and it was quite easy to keep the water moving with the dredge. Shortly after the No. 1 dredge started, 400 acres came available nearby in Waikaka, and in reading Alec's memoirs, the message given to John McGeorge, who was in Dunedin at the time, was go and buy that land regardless of the price. Obviously they knew what was in there, and that was prospected too, and so they actually could get to the point of predicting per week what their dredges could recover. The second dredge again was a bought dredge. It came from the Galloway Flats, and it dredged for a very long time, from 1904 to 1926. Remember I talked about the load at the front end of the dredge with the dredge buckets? Look at the size of this construction here. I would suspect that dredge had electric power on it for a good part of its operating life, so that the operating it at night wouldn't be such a problem with just having to rely on hurricane lamps. A third dredge was then built, and this was built by the McGeorge brothers, and this was probably one of the biggest dredges of its type at the time, and here it is here, and it was designed to go down very deep. It went down 60 feet, which is very deep, and as you can see, here's the elevator shaft out the back, all covered in, so it's really a production facility. One of the interesting things, this was farming land, and the McGeorge brothers put an extension on their elevator so that they could take the topsoil off and store it out on the land beyond the whole of the dredge, so that after the dredging had been done in a particular area, that topsoil could be put back and the land reused. And I used to go down to this farm at Waikaka as a boy, and stay there. And it was a classic Southland fatland farm, beautiful green flat country. No one would know that it had been dredged apart from 2 big ponds, and those ponds I found were great because I was into model boats and I could make model boats go in my grandfather's pond, and thought that was quite neat. So the number 3 operated to 1923 when it had run out of the deep leads. The McGeorge brothers company stopped all dredging at Waikaka in 1926 because they basically dredged out their land, and the company was wound up in 1933 voluntarily. At Waikaka they got some 58,000 ounces of gold, and that was done in a simple low-cost operation compared to dredging on the Kawara, and as I've said, the land was returned to farming. Some thoughts on the Waikaka dredging. Obviously very easy, much easier dredging conditions than previously. Flat land, no river at all. Manoeuvring the dredge was much easier. You weren't dealing in a river with rock outcrops, etc. You were dealing with flat land, so that putting the lines out to control it were much simpler. A lot of the hazards were eliminated. You were putting more inside buildings, etc. Better lighting conditions. No problems with outside shareholders. It was the partnership, the family partnership. The topsoil recovery. The McGeorge brothers weren't the first to do that. Another party in the Waikaka Valley had started it, but they certainly, I think, were among the more extensive of recovering the land. Waikaka gold was very different from Clutha gold. Clutha gold is, that you may remember the picture of the 1,200 ounces. It's like peas. It's little nuggets of it. Waikaka gold was very fine, and so the sluice mechanism wouldn't work, and so that it had to be it was a much more complicated way of actually getting the gold out. So the gold, they'd get down to a very fine material at which the gold was embedded in. They would then have to use a chemical process to get the gold out of that. And what they did was, and it sounds dreadful, they had a bucket of mercury, and they put this material into the bucket, and the mercury formed an amalgam with the gold, and then they poured the mercury out of the bucket and distilled it, got the mercury back, and the gold separated out. Dealing with mercury and vapours of mercury, etc., very dangerous. And interestingly, that Alec and Joseph both lived to be quite old men. They didn't die early of chemical poisoning. But the one thing that really gives you the horrors is Alex said that if you put a wee stick of cyanide in the mercury, it made the process even go better. Osh would have something to say about that, wouldn't they? Interesting story. I have a ring that's made of gold from Waikaka, and that started life. It was a piece like a shilling that are part of this mercury distillation process. But the brothers had rings made for their wives, usually from the first gold that came off one of the dredges. And so when Alec got married, I believe it was the first gold that come off the number one. He'd taken it aside. But an interesting story was that in working at Waikaka, they became friendly with the local Roman Catholic priest who was based in Dunedin. I think because the family that was working the dredge was a Catholic family. The brothers got quite friendly with him, and he eventually became the Bishop of Dunedin, and he went to Ireland to be consecrated. Why they obviously had to do this, and he apparently had great joy in telling the congregation at his consecration that his bishop's ring was made by gold recovered by 2 good Presbyterians. So, just some quick figures. Alex started dredging when he was 25 years old. He floated a company when he was 28. They retired from hands-on work when they were 33. They had hands-on dredging for something like 12 years, but they were in the gold industry as owners and directors of the company for over 34 years. And they regularly visited all their dredges and were very much in control of what was happening. So no flash in the pan, this one. The McGeorge families, if you've got the time. Right, starting with John, because he's the older one. This is a picture of John that I got from one of his other grandchildren, Helen Mathewson, who lives in Waikaka. He had his own business as a consulting engineer, so he didn't work on the dredges. He was an investor, and he designed tram car and cable car systems, and Ken Boddy's got some very detailed plans of cable car systems that he's done, as well as the dredge plans. He worked in both New Zealand and Australia. He had 4 sons and 3 daughters. He lived in Avalon, which is in the corner of McGeorge Avenue and High Street. Large house there. Eglinton Road. Thank you. Yes, you're right. You're right. He died in 1923 at 62 years of age. Joseph, he worked. Okay, yes, certainly. Yeah, Joseph, my grandfather, he basically worked his life in gold dredging, apart from the short time when he was involved in drapery. His wife never liked the mention of the word drapery. She thought that wasn't proper enough. He was the businessman of the group. He ran the books, etc., and the books from the company are in the Hocken Library. As I said, they weren't so successful, Kate and Joseph. They only had one son, Murray, who was my father. They lived in Linwood Avenue, in London Street. And contrary to Alec, they never owned a car. So whenever they went anywhere, they did so by taxi. They were keen trampers and climbers. Once they went off the dredges working, the McGeorge brothers would go up to Mount Cook and did a lot of climbing. My grandmother climbed. Too, I have her ice axe. So ladies in long dresses climbing in the Mount Cook area. They went over the top into Milford Sound, carrying a glass plate camera to take photographs. They were pretty active in things outside their work. My grandparents travelled quite a bit. They went to England in 1911 for a year. They spent time in Canada and the United States, and then they went with my father to England in 1935 when he went to do further his medical studies, and they came home through Europe and India. My grandmother was early involved in Plunket, because they were friendly with Sir Rupert King, and she in fact was national president in the 1930s of national president of Plunket. My grandfather died when he was in 1948, when he was 84. I can just vague memories because I was 5 at the time, so I have memories of this man who had a bad hip, who died at that time. Alec, he spent his life in the gold dredges. With the gold dredge, he's a real dynamo. He was the moving force behind this in terms of getting things happening. I think he would fair to say he was intense. He was a disciplinarian. When we had a reunion of the McGeorge brothers in 1995, that was 100 years from when they first got started, and at that, people were waxing eloquent about Alec, and one of the grandsons put his hand up and said, "He was a pretty tough dad." My father tells a story that he actually, once the electricity was organised, he had a buzzer installed in the light in the dormitory where the girls slept, and so he could press the buzzer for them to get up in the morning and get things going. He had a house in Highgate, corner of Highgate and 11th Street. There's a big brick house there. I think Richard Thompson, the councillor, actually lives in it nowadays. It was called Kawara. There was an acre of land there. It's been split up. From my father, actually, the last place he lived was on the land that was part of Kawara. Alec had a very early interest in cars. He had Humbers and Clement Bayards and Minervas and goodness knows what, starting in 1907. Did a trip right around the South Island as far as you could drive in 1914, so that's pretty early days. a long-time member of the AA. He had a long association with Karitani, as I think I've mentioned Karitani before. He had a property there which had tennis courts and all sorts of things. And in 1920s, he bought land further out of Karitani and he gave a quarter of an acre to each of his children. He had 5 daughters and 4 sons. Four sons, but one was stillborn. And he shared my grandfather's interest in tramping, etc. He died in 1953 at 86. As I've said, we celebrated the 100 years, and because that celebration was so much fun, in 2005 we celebrated the celebration at 10 years, and next year's 2015 we might do it again, who knows? And anybody interested, there's actually a plaque on the back of the old Bannockburn Bridge piers noting that celebration. We got resource consent for that. We've got documentation. We're very lucky that, like the Suhois, there's a lot of documentation down to very small details, receipts and etc. Alec kept a folio book for his letters, so there's a great deal of copies of letters that he wrote, etc. Just a couple of years ago, one of the granddaughters published this book. It's called Dredging the Past, the Life of A.C. McGeorge. Alec wrote memoirs in 1949, and he wrote memoirs for the family, and I have a copy of those, which, this is a reasonably rare book. He only had 25 copies printed and he destroyed the plates, so there couldn't be any further reprints. So I treasure this because it's got a message from Alec, and I can remember Alec having Christmas dinner at my grandparents' place. But this book by Lois reprints the memoirs completely, and then has a lot more material in it.
Copies are in the museum.
Great. Yeah, and I'm sure there is probably spare copies floating around, and if anybody actually wanted to buy a copy, that could be arranged. I think that's about the end of it. Yes, so I'll say thank you, and any questions?